Morning, everyone. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us. I know it's early in the week, but some big issues to talk about this morning. As you'll know, this is a really big question that policymakers are thinking about. And so we're really fortunate to have in my view, two great people, but two of the leading experts in the country to take us through some of this conversation and discussion. So you're very welcome to the webinar. The plan ahead of us this morning is relatively straightforward. You'll hear from me, Emmet Regan. So I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Mutual Ventures. I've been here for 10 years and specialise in big transformation in children's social care. I've been lucky enough to work with the two colleagues on the call. We're joined by Colin Foster, Chief Executive of Northamptonshire Children's Trust, a storied history in children's services and children's social care. We'll hear from Colin in the coming minutes about his journey, about Northamptonshire's journey, and some of the issues that I think are really prescient to the conversation. And then also alongside us is Ian Dodds, again, someone we've been fortunate to work with for a number of years from Achieving for Children, to really show us his leadership story in Achieving for Children, the difference that it's making in Kingston, Richmond and beyond, and some of the challenges I think that face in dealing with multiple governance systems, multiple structures, and how that all fits together. So a really good, interesting morning ahead of us in discussion. I'll present a couple of slides on my side just to give you a little bit of context and perspective on where we are. Then we'll move to Colin and then to Ian. And then I would really encourage you in the chat to start putting in your questions now, because I think it will be quite a popular conversation for discussion and debate. That will focus on many issues. And I think what we need to get from this morning is not an obsession of labels or legal words or structures, but how is it that the colleagues on the call are dealing with different governance systems and different structures, and how is it that they're making a really difference and driving change? And so that for us, I think is really exciting. And when I was preparing for the discussion this morning, I took a step back to really understand how unique I think this challenge is for policymakers up and down the country. And I think there are a few challenges in LGR that are affecting both districts, unitary authorities, but also the real challenge for policymakers centrally. So how is it if we're constructing new children's services, new organisations, how do those things look in a very different perspective with different contexts and different experiences? And I think that's something that we'll tease out this morning in our conversation. So again, colleagues, very much looking forward to the discussion this morning, very much looking forward to your Q&A. I will now begin to share some slides to take us through where we are in terms of the context, and then following me, we'll pass over to Colin. So we Mutual Ventures have done and have a long history in working alongside leaders in children's social care, children's services to drive change and to look at different models of how that change can happen. Over a number of years, there's been different organisations, different ways of looking at things. And what we'll do this week is produce a paper which will help policymakers, will help decision makers look at the different options that are out there, and also how things have worked in different ways in different places. And so what we've looked at, like any good management consultancy with snappy titles, is a different model. So one of disaggregation and one of aggregation. Now, I think, again, some of these are up for debate and discussion, but what they're really trying to do is look at how you as policymakers and decision makers construct children's social care and children's services moving forward. And there are different models. We'll hear from two colleagues in a moment about that, but providing you with a different perspective of either looking at multiple services across an area or looking at bringing services together in one area. So that there are those examples that we'll talk about in a moment, but looking at how we can pull those different models together. And if we just go on to the next slide, just looking at some what we've called case studies or different issues that sit in those two models, some things I think for you to really think about as we go. So I think, and again, we'll hear from Colin, we'll hear from me, and just pulling out a couple of issues that I know are really important, particularly around stability and workforce stability, and some of those changes and some of those issues that really happen in different models, retaining and understanding, and also that role of Ofsted, inspection, governance, how does that work in relation to risk too? And then I think on the second model, so pulling together those services, and again, I'm really looking forward to hearing this particularly from you, Colin, is creating that new culture, that new identity. How does that work, and what does that really mean in practice? Because it's really easy for me to come along and say you should have cultural integration, brilliant, but what does that actually mean, and how does that happen, and what does that really mean in terms of driving it forward? And I think as we hear from Ian too, particularly around those safeguarding arrangements, the partnership arrangements that are so crucial to any public service, and colleagues may know on the call that Mutual Ventures is working with the Innovation Unit to drive forward the changes in relation to the Families First Pathfinder. That's something we're really seeing too, is that importance of the partnership and just what a key role that's playing too. So plenty for us to think about, and we'll send across this week the information that we've produced so that you're able to get a sense of it too as you begin in your journeys and your challenges. But Jordan, if you push me on one. So again, just to touch a little bit on some of the context. So again, we've been lucky to work across a number of areas. And I think being really clear on any new model, and again, I don't want to be slavish to the word trust or slavish to the word organization, but any new body that is involved or is bringing together different services, I think these three things really apply and are really true. And I think I would say this, wouldn't I, but getting it right first time is incredibly crucial to some of this work. And I would say taking your time to do it is as important, because, and we'll hear, I'm sure, there are challenges that these organizations don't just get created, they have to exist. And so how is it we think about that as we work through? And again, I think a key theme for public services, and I think we'll hear more from the government in terms of the spending review into June and July around their prevention agenda and that kind of movement within the system. How does that work with system-wide partners too? How is it that we would focus on that? And I think a real reflection from some of the work that we've been privy to is just really understanding the budget and what does that mean in practice in terms of being able to know not just what the budget is, but what you're actually spending, and how does that work when you're inheriting a new body or creating a new body, and how do you deal with some of those legacy issues, some of those challenges, some of the real issues that can, if not distract, certainly take the focus of a new leadership team trying to run a new organization too. So real things to think about and to focus on. But again, we'll send this paper across during the week to attendees of the webinar, and I'm sure wider as well. But I think now is a real opportunity for us to do things. So to hear from two of the leading experts in the country, which I'm really excited about, and their journey and their leadership journey. And then also that we'll leave plenty of time in the Q&A, and feel free to start popping in those questions as you go. I'll curate those for us as we finish the two presentations. So Colin, if you're happy now, I'll hand to you for you to take us through. Colin's on a very strict time limit, so don't worry, I will make sure that I keep on top of the timings, Colin. A minute or two leeway is fine, but over to you, and very much looking forward to it. I think, Colin, in traditional webinar style, you're on mute.
Thanks, Emma. I'm getting a T-shirt printed. Say sorry, I'm on mute. Thank you for the introduction, and yeah, I absolutely agree on timescales, because the most important part is hearing questions that colleagues on the call do have. So I have to say, very kind words from Emmet earlier on, but my two other colleagues on the call, Emmet and Ian, when I joined Northamptonshire in November 2020, were both very instrumental in my learning and my understanding. And you know, it's one of the things I'd say, and it'll be a bit of a theme, is that who's the person you can pick up the phone to? Who's the person you can drop an email to and ask, can you help me out here? And I know I can do that with both Emmet and Ian. And, you know, hopefully, you know, we can help you gain a bit more understanding of what could happen, and any thoughts, reflections that you have. So anyway, to trust or not to trust, is that the question? Often in local government reorganisation, or when there's an intervention in children's services, there is a question as whether the children's services element of local authority should be taken out of the council context, so through an alternative delivery mechanism, or what's often referred to as a children's trust. Now, it's really interesting that that's become a thing over the last 10 years or so. I recall a speech from the PM at the time, about 2016, who said that by 2020, 60% of children's services will be operated by a children's trust. But that obviously didn't happen. A children's trust or an ADM model became an intervention where places where there was concerns about standards. The only one that isn't, of course, is Ian's arrangement, which he will, I'm sure, come on to a little bit more later. The other thing to say about the folk on the call is there are only two alternative delivery models for children's services that operate across more than one authority area. One is Northamptonshire, which operates under West and North Northamptonshire councils, and one is the 3 councils that Ian serves. The others are all a single alternative delivery model for a single local authority. So that helps give a bit of context. I've done local government reorganisation twice in my career, once here in Northamptonshire in 2021 and also in Bedfordshire in 2009. So I'll share a little bit of learning there. But just before we move on to the next slide, my first experience of local government reorganisation was 1974 when I lived in Widnes, and Widnes was in Lancashire, and there was a change in local government, and Widnes was proposed to move to Cheshire. I remember being a 3-year-old child, seeing on the local news of placards from people in Cheshire saying we don't want Widnes. So the implications of LGR are wide-ranging for residents, and there's a serious point there about thinking through carefully of what is done and how that message is portrayed. So can we move on to the next slide, please? This is a very brief overview of alternative delivery models. Don't worry, I'm not going to read every single slide here, but it's really important to understand that there are a number of different alternative delivery models across a number of authorities. They're not all the same model. So some models have some of children's services in, so children's social care and targeted early help. Others have all children's services activity in them. There isn't one single standard model, and it's really important to understand that. So often I've had so many phone calls, I'm sure Emmet and Ian have too, around, well, should we do a trust? What would it look like? How would it work? And it's kind of like, what's the trust model? Well, there's loads of different ones in actual fact. And so, thinking carefully about, is this a way forwards is really important. And, there are a number of alternative delivery models that are reverting back into councils. Doncaster did a few years ago, Worcester are, and a number of others are too. But over in Birmingham, and of course in Ian's area as well, that is an ongoing contract and that's been extended. So it's the differences are fascinating. But what I would say is, generally speaking, alternative delivery models have been put in place where there are systemic concerns about local authorities' ability to operate children's services. That is the context for most of them. And the question is whether, if there was going to be local government reorganisation, whether this is a suitable vehicle in normal practice, because there will be many authorities who will be going through local government reorganisation who have outstanding children's services, who have good children's services. Is this a way forward? I mean, that's a question to ask. But yeah, and on that point, I'll move on to the next slide. Because fundamentally, my learning from local government reorganisation and leading a children's trust arrangement is there's a number of things that you need to be aware of, and none of them are about the delivery model. They're all about how you do what you do. What I can say for sure is ADMs where there's been success has been a stable leadership team, an experienced leadership team that works with all local authority departments to create the best possible outcomes for children. That's the thing to focus on. And I've got a bit of some information on that, which may help in a moment. So what was interesting, the Bedfordshire experience, I was in Bedfordshire County Council that then split. So there were 3 authorities involved. There was South Bedfordshire, Mid Bedfordshire, and Bedford Borough. So what happened was the Bedford Borough became a continuing unitary authority. So they've been in existence for years, whereas South Bedfordshire and Mid Bedfordshire merged to form Central Bedfordshire. So there was kind of a different model there on how you do local government reorganisation. In Northamptonshire, there were 7 districts and boroughs and 1 county who both merged to form 2 unitary authorities. So slightly different experiences, but a lot of the learning's the same. So there'll be, if you look at that second bullet point down there, at the time of the split, the change, there'll be lots of well-intentioned ideas. So that, like the extent of support services, how those support services operate, and often there'll be a suggestion that, well, we could do this across the councils. One council host, the other council deliver. The other council sort of pay part of that arrangement as a in a shared services agreement type thing. In almost within 3 to 5 years, the majority of those support services will desegregate. it's just what happens when people evolve, as organisations evolve. You know, and it's like there's arguments about costs and so on and so forth. And a lot of time, particularly in Bedfordshire, was wasted on arguments about those shared services agreements that were set up with good intention at the point of local government reorganisation. So the 1st of April 2009, Bedfordshire split, you know, and everything was desegregated except youth justice services by 2013. So it's thinking through that. There's a bullet point there, lots of consultants, present company accepted. There are lots of people that will come and try and tell you how to do this. The best people that are people that are experienced in the sector, that both officer level and also consultant level. So the respected organisations such as Mutual Ventures are the people to align to. But lots of people come and say, "Oh, I've done this loads, and I'll tell you how to do it." The risk of Section 1114 notice is significant. The budget, as Emmet mentioned, can be a real challenge. But unfortunately, sometimes things can be created through short-term financial understanding. You know, so the cost of placement for a child costs too much money. We've got to address that. Children's services aren't performing. That's nonsense. Look at the system. What's your post-18 accommodation like? How many local children's homes are there? What's post-16 accommodation like? What's the offer for care leavers? There's lots of things to think about. And if we just move on to the next slide, I'll talk about that. Fundamentally, through the research we've done, and the research has been interviewing a number of experts in the sector and lots of reading. So I've published an interim paper, which will be in the MJ next week. So I'm happy to take any questions on that outside of this. But there are 7 key areas that's been distilled through that research to create the best possible children's services offer. Now, just going through those one by one, inspection outcomes are not the be all and end all. So you should say, what's our current inspection outcome profile? That's an absolute valid question to ask. But if something isn't going well with Ofsted, then it's not always just children's services. There's a lot of system challenges there as well. So, for example, a number of local authorities recently have got inadequate judgments because the corporate care leavers offer has not been sufficient and isn't safeguarding care experienced young adults. Okay, that's a systemic problem, not a children's services problem. Although children's services are part of the solution. So they're the areas. Quality of practice, that includes, you know, across how the whole system works to support children in the local authority. Stability of workforce, obviously it's a real challenge to recruit social workers. What's the corporate offer for those social workers? What's the partnership approach? How are things working in the safeguarding partnership? Financial sufficiency, obviously, but I would urge anyone that is looking at the numbers to not go, that's too expensive, we need to cut that. Okay, there are always efficiencies that can be made, but let me tell you, the biggest efficiency that can be made is reducing the number of children that come into the care system in the first place. Okay, if that's human beings we need to talk about, much rather talk about children. But if you want to look at where the money is, where the cash is, it is also there. That is the biggest area to focus on. How can you help children, young people and families stay together rather than coming to the care system? In Northamptonshire, I've got a graph, it's not on these slides, but there was a forecast in 2020, but it's a linear forecast that said by 2025, this will be the number of children in care. I mean, I've put the actuals on that as well. Because of the improvement in practice in Northamptonshire, there are 241 less children in care now than that forecast showed. So that's great outcomes for children, most importantly. But secondly, that cost is somewhere in the region of £30 million. Okay, so that's where the money is. It's support to getting that system right, and this matrix helps do that and creates a psychological safety for people to operate. Because if you're operating, you feel like you're always going to be told off or found out or put in the press for not performing, then you're unlikely to have a successful children's services. Okay, fine. Let's just move on to final slide. So this is what developed through the research. It's a maturity matrix that covers those 7 areas and has great descriptors for each. Now, I'm not going to talk through this, don't worry. And there's only got about 30 seconds left. So, but each of these is a judgment on where the local authority areas act. What I would strongly suggest is when you're planning local government reform, think about these 7 areas and think about what you want it to look like. And then where are you now? And it's okay to say we're a 1. You know, there might be a lack of understanding about how it works. You know, this isn't about catching out. It's about creating a service that will work and improve outcomes. And most of all, create successful children's services within a successful local authority. You'd never see a failing children's services in a high performing authority. And that shows the systemic point in my view. And that's me done. Just over to the final slide. We have to do what we do because it matters, and we do whatever it takes to improve outcomes for children. I hope that's been helpful. Happy to be contacted after this. And back to you, Emmet. I hope that was timely.
Incredibly timely, I would suggest, and there's a lot in there, Colin, as well. And I think we'll pick up some questions and really looking to pick your brains, I think, a little bit on those relationships and how you maintain them. I think particularly kind of in a multi-governance world, to coin a phrase, how is it you're engaging with those authorities? And I think, unsurprisingly, Colin, a brilliant perspective in two different ways, in two different contexts of the journey. And I think I am always wary of consultants too, so don't be worried about that. I think it's right to be skeptical of those proffering advice and those proffering solutions off the shelf. And I think I would really push for, as you'll know, the work that we've been involved in previously, the kind of lifting and shifting a model is never going to work. And what this call is really instructive and really helpful, but people on their own journey need to be really conscious that they're on their own journey. It's great to learn from others, but I think, as we'll know from work we've done, it's as much about the journey as it is the destination. And you can't just come with a nice, as much as anyone would want, a nice PowerPoint slide, a nice spreadsheet, and go, we fixed it for you. It's the work and the trust that's built in the room, no pun intended, that's what drives outcomes and results. So again, we'll tease that out in the Q&A to come. Ian, can I turn to you, and we'll shift on the slides as well. Ian, again, a brilliant opportunity to hear from you the work of AFC, and I think, as Colin says, that kind of unique mix of working both within boroughs and beyond boundaries, and how is it that works in practice, and some of those lessons learned. And I do think the kind of creation of AFC is different contextually to the creation of Northamptonshire, and it's really interesting to see these different perspectives. But I think you'll see there's quite a lot of crossover in the need for good working together, in the need for partnership working, in the need for knowing and understanding your service. How, yes, context is different and structure will be different and governance will be different, but actually I think some of those lessons apply equally across both organisations, and indeed those on their LGR journey too. So Ian, to you.
Thank you very much, and morning, colleagues. So as Emmet said, I'm Ian Dodds. I'm the Exec Director of Children's Services in Kingston and Richmond, and I am responsible for the services in Achieving for Children. Like Colin, this isn't my first time doing local government reorganisation, although I don't go as far back as he does. So my first experience was when we moved Medway out of Kent in 1997. It wasn't a strategic role for me. I was responsible for putting the coloured dots on the chairs and desks. But since then, I've been leading services in Achieving for Children. So the next slide, please. So I gave a talk on something similar at the Regional Care Cooperative Conference in Manchester recently, and I'm very aware that people don't understand where Kingston and Richmond are in a London context, because we're two very small boroughs in southwest London. So I put some context here, and I was told to update my cultural references as well. So Richmond is the home of Ted Lasso and also Twickenham Rugby Stadium. Kingston, the home of Stormzy and Chessington World of Adventures. So we're relatively small London boroughs in southwest London, serving about 40,000 children. So the next slide sets out the journey around Achieving for Children. So our journey actually started in 2010. So this was when the real start of the government austerity measures under the old Conservative and Liberal Democrat coalition government. And as part of that conversation, we had conversations locally about how we might deliver services differently and more cost efficiently across two small London boroughs. And we started a conversation then around bringing together all services across the two councils in Kingston and Richmond. And our children, and we didn't get very far. They were quite complex conversations, but then we had a kind of a big moment where the previously outstanding graded Kingston Council's children's services were found to be inadequate in their Ofsted inspection in 2012. And that kind of speeded up that idea that we should bring together at least the children's services of Richmond and Kingston as the kind of improvement, Richmond being the improvement partner for Kingston. And so we began then to develop a shared children's service, which was then called the Thames Agreement, and in 2014 formed into Achieving for Children. And so Achieving for Children is a community interest company that delivers all the children's services, so everything early help, education support, children's social care, on behalf of the 2 local authorities. And in 2014, those local authorities were equal shareholders in that company. They held 50% of the shares in the company each. And they're pretty similar demographically, and they're pretty similar in terms of size and budget, and that worked well for us because that's a very clear and even split across the 2 local authorities. The start of the company was really about consolidating practice in Kingston and bringing it up to the same level as practice in Kingston. So that was a lot of our work initially. And by 2015, we've managed to get Kingston to be good from inadequate, which was a significant achievement. And a lot of that was around setting up the company, setting up our practice standards and doing that improvement work in Kingston. And that was recognised in a number of external awards, not just Ofsted, but we were also named Social Work Employer of the Year because of the work that we'd done in stabilising the workforce, which was a significant factor in Kingston being judged inadequate originally. And when we set up the company, there was a really clear vision that we would be a company that expanded in terms of the number of local authority members. So we'd started with Richmond and Kingston, but the idea was that we would expand to be 5 local authorities in the Achieving for Children model, but also we would expand in what we were delivering. So in terms of consultancy work, but also in terms of services that we could trade. And that journey began in 2017 when we admitted Windsor and Maidenhead Council into Achieving for Children. So we then became a service delivering on behalf of 3 local authorities. And in 2018, we expanded by developing our provider services arm. So that's where we developed children's homes, supported accommodation and edge of care services for our 3 local authorities. And we also provided some of those for other local authority areas too. In 2018, there was a change in political leadership in both local authorities. And I mention that because actually the model has survived the change in administration. So we've gone from being Conservative administrations to Liberal Democrat ones. And actually the strength of the model is it survived that and is seen as a trusted model in terms of delivering children's services. And then just towards the end of the journey, we're now judged outstanding by Ofsted based on the consolidation of the work that we've done since 2015. Our contract has been renewed. So it was originally a 12-year contract. That's just been renewed for a further 5 years. And we've had our second Ofsted grading in terms of outstanding. So that's all very good. And now we're looking towards 2016 when our next contract renewal is due, and then also looking about how we might develop the model in terms of what we're talking about today. So obviously Windsor and Maidenhead is in Berkshire, and what will that look like in terms of local government reform, and how might we use the Achieving for Children model in any future reorganisation of the 6 Berkshire authorities. And of course, whilst it's not as imminent, London will also go through some form of local government reform, I should imagine, and how we might look at that and the Achieving for Children model in terms of what a regionalised or a sub-regional London delivery model might look like. So that's a bit about our journey. The next slide sets out some of my observations on where we are now. So if we could change the slide. Great. So what was really important in establishing them was getting our storytelling right with staff and stakeholders at the beginning about what we were doing. And we had that long run up. So we'd done a lot of that conversation from 2010 onwards. So by 2014, everyone understood what we were trying to achieve, our long-term vision for the company, and staff had bought into that model. And that was really important because we needed those staff to stay with us during that period of what was quite turbulent change. And so that narrative, that storytelling was really important from concept of what Achieving for Children might look like, and then the creation of the alternative delivery model and how it would work. I think it's fair to say that the model we have now in terms of our ADM doesn't look like the model we started with, and we've iterated it over time. So in the last 10 years, the model has changed quite frequently to adapt to local circumstances, not least the growing by admitting a new member. And we've done a lot of testing and a lot of trialing and a lot of pilots to make sure we've got it right. But I think the most important thing about the model is that it does change and it does adapt and develop, and it is agile and flexible enough to do that. At the heart of it, though, is that the councils must or want to retain sovereignty. They want to be able to own the company and see how it is delivering for the 3 separate local authorities. They're very keen on preventing any sniff of cross-subsidy in terms of the model. So we have to be very clear that we spend money on children, and children belong to a local authority area, and we don't cross-subsidise. Obviously, what we do is achieve really good financial efficiency economy by where we can do something once across the model, we do that in that way. So they benefit from financial efficiency, but they're also owning their own children. And in order to achieve that, we have to put in a lot of effort in terms of leadership and working on getting an agreement and alignment across the 3 local authorities. So the alignment, we do things once where it's sensible to do so, but where they want a bespoke local solution, we're also able to deliver that as well. All of our services across Kingston and Richmond are fully integrated. So we have some locality teams, but the majority of our services are delivered by a single team working across Richmond and Kingston. There is a separate team in Windsor and Maidenhead because it is so geographically separate from the 2 London authorities. But bringing together those services has been time consuming, particularly where we are looking at harmonising things like staff terms and conditions, salaries, etc., etc. So those things have taken time to achieve. We've also had to work with staff around the right behaviours for working across 2 local authorities. So we don't have Kingston, Richmond staff, we have Achieving for Children staff, but they need to behave in a different way and respect the kind of decision making and the way that the individual local authorities do things. So they need to be quite agile. And they need to think quite carefully in terms of the different circumstances that they're in. So we have, everyone in Kingston and Richmond accepts that we are a shared service, but actually we don't big up Kingston in Richmond or Richmond in Kingston or vice versa. We don't play the 2 local authorities off against each other. We respect their individuality. We've had a range of different governance models, and I'm probably still not sure we've got it right. There is a lot of governance, a lot of reporting, and a lot of scrutiny in our model because we have a company governance model. So we have a board of directors that provides a level of scrutiny towards us, but we also have to report into the 3 different local authorities. That's a second layer of scrutiny, and then we also have the independent scrutiny that things like the Safeguarding Children Partnership brings. So quite often we are doing things 2, 3, 4 times, and that can feel quite draining, and also it's very time consuming. And so we've reached a point now where we apply a lens across our governance and scrutiny arrangements in that they must add value to the children and young people that we work with. We don't do things just because people want us to report into them. That has to improve outcomes for children and young people, and that test has been really important for us. We've managed to enhance our strategic partnership. So when we want to be seen as a member of the local authority, we are, but if we want a bit of independence and a separate seat on the table, we can also get that as well by using the Achieving for Children model. So that's worked well for us in terms of strengthening our relationships with strategic partners, particularly the Integrated Care Board, but also the police and some of our health provider organisations as well. And one of the best things that we did in the model was we moved our support services in-house. So finance, HR, IT are in-house. We have a bespoke solution which is for Achieving for Children, and it works for us, and we're not tied into the other arrangements in the local authorities, which didn't always work in the best interests of children's services or for children and families. And we've managed to create in-house solutions which do that. Then the last two slides look at some of the strengths and weaknesses, and I think I'm starting with the strengths. So the model has enabled us to retain specialist teams that as 2 small or 3 small local authorities we wouldn't have been able to do, and that has obviously led to better economies of scale. We've brought together 3 different organisational cultures into a single Achieving for Children culture, so we've been able to create a whole new child-focused organisational culture, which I think has been really important in terms of staff recruitment and retention. And when we do our staff surveys and our pulse surveys, that's what staff tell us, that they enjoy working for an organisation that is entirely focused on children, young people and families. I've mentioned our support services, and that's enabled us to be more flexible in how we deliver to children and families in Richmond, Kingston and Windsor and Maidenhead. We've tailored our approaches to workforce stability and satisfaction. We don't rely on corporate approaches that we previously did in the local authorities. We've been able to be more creative in how we can recruit and retain staff, and some of our rewards packages for staff. We're more nimble in that, in terms of things like maternity, paternity and adoption leave, fostering leave, etc., etc. We've created a more family-focused approach to our workforce. We can get access to funding opportunities we couldn't previously as a local authority. We can take more creative approaches to how we develop our services and act in a more commercial way that we had struggled to do. It wasn't impossible, but we'd struggled to do it when we were part of the local authority. And we've developed a provider services model, which is now largely focused on our in-house delivery, just because that's the local circumstances. But that, sharing foster carers, sharing residential care arrangements, sharing supported accommodation across the 3 local authorities has improved our placement efficiency and our placement choice, and has made matching much easier than it has been with just a 3 small local authorities. And I think, our own work, but also external validation from Ofsted, shows that the model has improved outcomes for children and young people. And then lastly, the areas we continue to struggle with in the model. So the first one of those is the comment. So it's next slide, please. So the last one is one around otherness, in that people don't really understand what the alternative delivery model is, and we have to spend a lot of time explaining it. And sometimes when things get tough, people can say, oh, that's Achieving for Children, rather than owning the issue as a local authority. And that can prove challenging in terms of some of the things Colin's just mentioned around systemic ownership of issues like support for care leavers. So we've had to work really hard on moving closer to the local authority, anchoring ourselves in the local authority rather than being seen as separate or other. It's time consuming because everyone wants a little bit of you, and you have to spread yourself evenly across the 3 local authorities in terms of senior leadership visibility, making connections so that people are confident about the model that you've delivered, and that they believe that you are their DCS, you are their Director of Social Care. So that is time consuming, and more time consuming than we've had working in a single local authority. I've talked about over governance and scrutiny, and the fact that we've had to work towards something which is much more balanced in terms of feeling that we're not reporting more than once or twice. The inspection system is a significant burden for us, because we've got 3 local authorities having 3 separate local authority sets of inspections, whether that's the ILACS inspection or the SEND inspection. We're also, as an alternative delivery model, we have to have a separate independent fostering agency, so we have a separate set of inspections around that. All of our provider services, our registered children's homes now, supported accommodation, have inspections. So I think we're subject to something like 18 regular inspections, and that's quite time consuming. and is an additional burden of this model. We struggle where local authorities are in different financial positions, in that they can make different decisions around how they spend their budget. And a lot of our time is working to make sure that we can deliver integrated services when there are different financial strategies, plans, positions in each of the 3 local authorities, and harmonising that and trying to hold an integrated service together is quite challenging in those circumstances. Harmonising systems is also challenging. So it's taken us 8 years to get to a single staffing structure with the same pay and rewards package across the 3 local authority areas. And we're still working on harmonising IT systems. That is, well, blows my mind. I can't even get there. We have to do a lot of work in making sure on big decisions, i.e. whether we admit a new local authority or whether develop a new service, we have to get 3 sets of members, 3 sets of officers in the right place. That again is time consuming. And then lastly, the contract means that you know, we're forever heading towards a contract renewal, and there's a lot of work involved in that, and that can be destabilizing for staff, because they'll question around, are we going to continue, are we going to be moved back into the councils? If we've had a change in administration, there's all those questions as well, and that can be destabilizing. And so we have to work very hard to hold the organisation together at times when we're coming towards contract renegotiations. I think probably I'll leave it there, because I know we want to leave some time for some questions, Emmet.
Thanks, Ian. It sounds like there's very much a separate webinar on the IT systems of achieving for children, which maybe not posted on a Monday morning to be discussed. If I can remind colleagues to place their questions in the Q&A, there's a few beginning to come in now, which I'll address. But using chair's privilege, if I can, Colin, Ian talked quite eloquently, perhaps unsurprisingly, about relationships and the importance of relationships, particularly working across, in the instance of AFC, 3 different organisations and beyond. And I just wondered, given the challenges that were in Northamptonshire at the time, in terms of that council's history from the county council splitting into 2, just how you've seen your role and your team's role in if not managing those relationships, building those relationships, because a lot of people will come quite new in terms of the districts and other things into children's services. And so I'm just wondering, now with a little bit of perspective, not to age you, what are your thoughts just in that space would be helpful. And again, Colin, not your t-shirt, but you're on mute. You're definitely on mute for me, Colin.
No. Is that any better?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Sorry, I don't know. That was very strange. I had a few IT issues, colleagues, linking to what was said earlier, actually. Yeah, IT is a real challenge. But that's a good question. I mean, you can't underestimate the impact of different cultures coming together and different views for elected members of different areas. So, for example, if you take Northamptonshire, where there's 7 districts and borough councils and 1 county that formed into 2 unitaries, the level of different understanding, different views, and particularly when you layer on local authority area, was the county council was subject to a section 114 notice, significant, historic inadequacy in children's services going back several years, lots of challenges with the DFE intervention and how that would work, and most of that playing out publicly. So the relationship point is really important, and I'll be really honest, the first few years caused some real challenges, because some people come in on a short-term basis, they have a view, and really it's about kind of making a point rather than improving services for children. So we've got to a sensible place now, but this is nearly 4.5 years in, to actually get some momentum about the improvement that Ian described. So that's why the matrix point for me is quite important, because you need to name that level of corporate support and understanding, level of political support and understanding. And it's okay to say this isn't quite where it needs to be. That's the point. And if I was doing this again, I think those conversations should have been had at the beginning. Functionally, the change happened and it worked, but some of that historic culture. I mean, if there was a silver bullet and everyone knew how to do that every single time, then let me know, because there isn't. But there's just a bit of learning there from the past. But it is a challenge, and at the end of the day, to have an effective children's services, solid, stable, experienced leadership, where the requirements are understood by the whole system, both political and corporate level, is the best way to improve children's services, whatever model that is. But in the main, a local authority delivery model with that ethos, with that approach, can be successful. But again, it's a challenge.
Really, really helpful. And I think the thing to pull out of both yourself and Ian's very honest kind of discussions is just the issue about time. And that actually, if we're still thinking about stuff 8 years on, or you're still thinking about stuff 4.5 years on, there's ultimately what I think is realistic in the planning for some of these things as well, and what is it that we can do. And Ian, I've had a very, very specific question that I think you've begun to address in your presentation, but just if there was any either particular academic research or any work that's been done on the impact of AFC specifically. So is there, I think you had referenced obviously Ofsted and the work that had been done, but are there other kind of points of information or reference points to point colleagues to?
Well, we feature in Colin's research, but no, not as far as I'm aware.
No, very helpful.
I think there were. I think if there is, they're quite old, and if I'll dig them out and send them to you so that you can pass them on, if that would be helpful to colleagues.
Probably nearly a philosophical question coming at this point, but Colin, just if you can begin to maybe address this, and then Ian, I'm sure you'll come in on the back of it, but how does the decision making or governance process change through LGR, and what impact does that have on the service? I think I might be struggling to hear you, Colin. Again, I think slightly struggling. You're back. Yep.
Yeah. Is that better now?
Yeah.
Sorry about that. It's my t-shirt, so I keep having to go on and off mute until it works.
Sorry, you just told us that you need to turn it on and turn it off again in order for it to work.
That's the best advice I've ever had from IT. Picking up on Ian's point, the point of doing the research I did was to keep me sane, because lots of different people were saying lots of different things, and I thought you need to take the time to look at it and look at what exactly is happening. And I absolutely echo everything Ian said in his presentation. Incredibly wise words. In terms of the decision making, well, of course, there's a refined committee structure in the new. The continuing authority or the new authority, and each authority sets up its own decision-making structure, and that's the sort of matrix bit about political support, what that decision-making structure looks like, what the scrutiny structures are, because it doesn't follow that the scrutiny structures that everyone experiences now, decision-making structures, would follow into the new or the continuing authority. They might. I mean, obviously there's full council, there's the meetings that are standard and required for local government, but actually there's some of the peripheral arrangements that aren't consistent. So decision-making in and of itself is a critical thing to nail down way in advance of any change. And so in both unitary arrangements, there's been learning since the arrangements were made. Either too many committees, not enough decision making, get delegated in the right place, and so on. So it's a really complex space, and exactly that's the level of detail that really needs to be gone into across the whole of the local authority in order to, on that vesting day, on day one, that everything is clear and well understood. Because that's not always the case.
Colin, if I could just stick with you while I have you unmuted. A question I'm interested in your views on applying the psychological safety matrix to a senior manager making decisions about whether or not and how much to restructure.
And I think that's a brilliant question, because it's about the psychological safety of the system. So if elected members alongside officers are working together on what are we trying to achieve, and it's not kind of you have to save this much money, tell us how you're going to do it, because you can shout at the problem all you like, it doesn't necessarily always solve the problem. And that applying it to an individual senior manager making a decision. It should be a cultural approach. It doesn't mean you don't challenge. Psychological safety isn't about not challenging and just being nice to everybody. It's not at all, but it's having a clear decision-making framework. So when you are a senior manager making a decision, as the question rightly asks, you feel that, okay, I can make this decision. I'm empowered to make this decision, and it's the right decision to make based on the parameters that we've agreed. That's for me is a psychologically safe approach. That does not mean there's not difficult decisions. But I'll give an example. Someone looked at the budgets in Northamptonshire County Council and went, "Oh, there's way too much money being spent on agency social workers." Right? Do you know what the answer was? To get rid of a load of other posts to fund the agency social worker overspend. So that was posts in early help. That was posts that did life story work for children in care, just completely ripped out the system, right? That doesn't save money. It might save money on the staffing line of your budget for a few years, but it doesn't fix the whole problem, because if your early help offer isn't right, then more children are going to come into care, and the most significant costs are those children in care. If it's effective life story work, then that can help children understand where they're at and perhaps move to a home that is more suited to their needs and go on to have an effective life in society. There's those types of things that are just misunderstood in naive and decision making with lack of understanding about the impact. So anything like that should be done in a rounded, equitable way rather than you're the problem. Someone stood on the stage in Northamptonshire and said to the whole workforce, the reason you are not getting a pay rise this year is because children's services cannot control their budgets. That is not okay. That is not the LA owning the challenge. That is isolating one area of the business to say they're not performing, so therefore you're all going to suffer. What do you think that does to the chat in the, when someone's having a coffee? It's not right. And I would really guard against any of that's the biggest failing in the local government reorganisations I've experienced when it gets into they're the problem, pointing fingers, and that whole drama triangle about who's the persecutor and who's the rescuer and who's the victim. It should be an adult to adult conversation. Thanks, Emmet.
Brilliant. Very powerful, Colin. Thank you. And obviously, a number of things specific to Northamptonshire, but I think a number of things to take us wider. Ian, I'm going to draw us to a close in a minute or two, but just a question or a theme that's come up in the Q&A, just in relation to you being an existing organisation with Kingston and Richmond, and then onboarding Windsor and Maidenhead, and maybe just thinking about the situation that some colleagues are in. Any kind of key thoughts from that, or any kind of key things to think about in terms of onboarding maybe a new member, in inverted commas, to an existing organisation?
So early conversation around what that looks like, clarity about their challenges. So really open due diligence around what the issues are for them, particularly around finance, their financial position. Early conversations around what their expectations are from the model in terms of what they want to get out of it, in terms of how they want to work, the governance requirements. And then, it is about finding the right partner so making sure that, Windsor and Maidenhead was a good fit for Achieving for Children, but also that Achieving for Children was a good fit for Windsor and Maidenhead. So for the geographical issue is one that we discussed a lot, because you can't provide fully integrated services across those three local authority areas, because Windsor and Maidenhead is a distance away from Kingston and Richmond. So, how would we make that work for our organisation, given that we already had a clear organisational culture, a clear way of working, clear structures in terms of our governance? And so, it was around doing all of that due diligence, essentially.
Really helpful. If I, Colin, warm you up to unmute, mute and unmute again for the final question. And I'll come to you after this question, the same question if I can. Colin, just on the journey that you've had, what you've learned, but both in all your experiences, is there one thing that you would have done differently, or one thing that sticks in your mind that if we'd done this in a different way, it would have made a real impact, knowing that hindsight is a perfect science, of course? I think we're warming up, Colin, in the you're back, I think.
Can you hear me okay now? Yeah, okay, takes 3 times. Sorry. One thing to have done differently, I think taking more time alongside elected members and senior council officers to agree what our milestones are and what the future will look like in 3 to 5 years' time. It was very much about the immediacy of the change, and we probably lost a year and a half of improvement activity here because people with very little experience were kind of trying to say, well, that's wrong and that's wrong and that's wrong, instead of us working together to create what's right. So I think it can fall into recrimination if those agreements are not set out clearly from the outset. And that's the maturity matrix can help have that conversation. Not that I'm selling it, it's a piece of research that I'm putting to the sector to help. That's it, no financial benefit for me at all.
And then Ian, one reflection?
So I've got 2. So the first one would be, I think we tried to grow too quickly, and actually a more measured approach to growth would have been beneficial for us in terms of consolidating Richmond and Kingston together, then consolidating Windsor and Maidenhead. So, we had significant financial savings to make as part of the model. We had to take out and did take out £10 million worth of savings in the first 2 years of creating Achieving for Children, and then we've had subsequent financial savings to make since then to operate as cost efficiently as we possibly can. So just growing more slowly and consolidating would have been one of my lessons. And I think the second one I would have brought the support services in much earlier than I did, because they were the enabler for us to operate much more efficiently and effectively and achieve and sustain positive outcomes for children and young people.
I think that's come across loud and clear. I'm sure Colin was nodding his head along there. And I think what also some of that support services is a proxy for control too, and being able to fulfill your promises to your staff about it feeling different and it feeling better because systems are more efficient and move quicker. I'll draw us to a close now if I can. I think it's been a really stimulating conversation. Thanks for colleagues for putting Q&A in the chat. That's been really helpful to talk through some of those issues, and I'm sure this is a question that's going to rumble on for certainly the coming months, if not the coming years, I suspect. But I think what we've heard from both Ian and from Colin is taking the time to get it right first time, really thinking through some of the challenges, and be wary of those who tell you they've done it before and it's really easy, because it's not. And this is as much about the journey as it is about the destination too, and working together in that way. So we'll produce this week, and we'll send to colleagues on the call, a paper that we've worked on to bring together some examples, to bring together some issues, and you'll be able to see that in your inbox. But from me and from Colin and from Ian, thank you very much for taking the time to be with us this morning. Really enjoyable conversation. I'm sure the conversation will continue. Thank you very much, everyone. Take care and bye.